questions or problems before we start? No? Sure. I'd like to talk a bit about continue with the Congress, the legislature. If I get time, I'd like to think about the way in which laws are made, if I get time afterwards. I'd like to go through a little bit of the texts. But first, you need your plaquette and the lexique on page 7. The lexicon on page 7. So, I'm talking about federal. Oh, I'm going to actually shut the door. Page 7. I'm talking about the national, the federal system. Of course, there are state powers as well. And we'll see in a moment two different kind of conflicts between state and federal powers in relation to the hierarchy of laws, which is very different from France. Many things are very different from France. We'll see in a moment, for example, the jury system in America is very different from France, the legal system. There's an institution in the United States called the grand jury, which doesn't exist in France. So, in your lexicon, page 7, number 7, the division of powers between federal and state governments. Number 8 says delegated enumerated powers. Do you remember? Those are the powers of whom? Ça, c'est des pouvoirs de qui, ça? On appelle delegated or enumerated powers. Do you remember? Don't be shy. Life is too short to be shy. No? That's federal powers. Okay? Federal powers. Reserved powers, number 9, are state powers, and concurrent powers, number 10, are shared powers. Yeah? So I'd like to look at 3 things, number 11, 12, and 13. Donc c'est la lexique à la page 7, la deuxième lexique. Okay. 11, 12, and 13, full faith and credit clause. The privileges and immunity clause and extradition. Okay. If you look in Article 4 in the Article 4 on page 16. Donc, on va revenir à la lexique, à la page 7, ok? Mais d'abord, je vais regarder. On peut rester sur la page 16 en fait. Page 16, Article 4, Section 1. So this clause is called the full faith and credit clause. Yeah? So this Article 4, Section 1. Full faith and credit. Ça veut dire une acceptation totale. Full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. And the Congress may, by general laws, prescribe the manner in which such acts, records, and proceedings shall be proved and the effect thereof. So full faith and credit means that every state must obey the court judgments of every other state. It must obey the court judgments. It must obey the licenses, the marriage licenses, the divorces, the family law documents. All legal deliberations and documents must be given full faith, foi, faith is like foi, and credit in every other state. The second one is called the Privileges and Immunities Clause. So I read on section 2, clause 1, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. What it means is that citizens of one state enjoy legal rights in every other state. That's the privileges and immunities clause. And then number 2 and 3, they go together. They're the extradition clauses. A person charged in any state with treason, felony, or other crime, who shall flee from justice and be found in another state, shall, on demand of the executive authority of the state from which he fled, be delivered up to be removed to the state having jurisdiction of the crime. Ça veut dire l'extradition. Okay? So there's a word in there that you should note. Yeah, is the word in line 1 of that is the word felony. Okay, felony, F-E-L-O-N-Y. A felony is it's a category of crime, felony. It's a category of crime for which the punishment is 1 year or more in prison. Yeah, it's a category of crime for which the punishment is 1 year or more in prison. And the criminal who commits a felony is called a felon. Okay? A felon in the United States loses their civic rights. So if you're a felon, you have no right to vote. You lose it permanently. Yeah? You don't have a right to vote anymore. It's politically important because, for example, in the year 2000, in Florida, in the presidential election, where George W. Bush was losing the election, his brother was governor of Florida, they calculated around Miami-Dade County, this district in Miami called Dade County. It's black, it's a black district. Black voters in Florida vote Democrat. Because of the racial imbalance in the justice system, most felons in Miami proportionally are black. Okay? So what Bush did was he took the address list of felons in Dade County in Miami. They calculated that black felons, of course, live in ghettos. So what they would do was ils ont effacé des rues, des quartiers, des rues entières autour des adresses des felons. Comme ça, ils ont calculé qu'ils effaceraient de la liste électorale beaucoup d'électeurs noirs démocrates. Okay, it's one of the main reasons that Bush won Florida. One of the main reasons that Bush was elected in 2000 was because of the use of the address list of felons. Okay, because felons lose their civic voting rights. Right? I mean, it was quite blatant. It was quite sans vergogne. They did that. Right? So these 3 clauses, then, the full faith and credit clause, the privileges and immunities clause, the extradition clause, these are clauses which oblige states to respect the laws in other states. So what do you do then if, for example, a doctor in Texas is sentenced to prison for performing an abortion, yeah, which has happened, yeah? If that doctor then leaves Texas and goes to Massachusetts, Massachusetts is obliged to return him to Texas, right? It's the extradition clause, okay? Because imprisonment is a constitutional punishment, right? What about the death penalty? Yeah? If somebody is condemned to death in Texas and then escapes to Massachusetts, clearly, full faith and credit, extradition, they'd have to be sent back. But there's a problem with the death penalty. If you go to Article 8, the 8th Alors, on va regarder just the amendments briefly. Yeah? The amendments. So, amendments, we've looked a little bit at the First Amendment. I'll come back to that in a moment. Amendment 4 is about the security of your home. Yeah? So, on est à la page 17 dans la plaquette. Yeah? Can you look at that? Page 17. Yeah? Read the text. Okay. Article 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. And no warrant is a mandat, shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or serment, oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Donc la police ne peut pas fouiller la maison sans avoir un mandat qui décrit exactement ce qu'ils vont rechercher. Okay, that's what that means. So it gives you legal protection in your home against intrusion by the police. Okay? Then Article 5, I want to look at, I want to read in detail. Yeah? I mean, j'empiète un tout petit peu sur le domaine judiciaire que je vais traiter plus tard, but I want to come back to the question of the hierarchy of laws. Okay? No person, so follow the text, please. Okay, ça c'est la Bible pour les Américains. Okay, yeah? And in an earlier clause around Congress, yeah, we're going to look at a phrase in Latin, une phrase latine, which is at the heart of all this. Right? No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime. Maintenant, on dirait pas infamous crime, on dirait felony. Yeah? Unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. So there's a word I've given you before in relation to impeachment. Yeah? Indictment. So indictment means accusation. All right? On ne prononce pas le C. Right? To indict. Yeah? Excuse-moi, là, au milieu, là, tu n'arrêtes pas. You're right in my line of sight. It's very annoying. Okay? If you don't want to be here, it's really not a problem. But if you're here, don't just chat all the time. That's kill you, man. Yeah, okay, all right? Yeah. So indictment means accusation. To indict is to accuse. Like for impeachment, for example, impeachment is not a judgment. Impeachment is an accusation. Et d'ailleurs, c'est quelle institution qui porte l'accusation de impeachment? Je vous ai déjà dit ça. The indictment is carried by which institution? No? Who is it who accuses Trump of corruption? The House of Representatives. Okay? The House of Representatives indicts the president. To indict is to accuse. Okay? So, je reviens à ça. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Donc, pendant la guerre ou danger public, on fait abstraction des droits un petit peu, on cache les droits. What is a grand jury? A grand jury does not exist in France. A grand jury is not a jury. A grand jury is a collection of 25 to 30 members of the public who are named by a court before the trial, avant le procès, to decide whether or not a case should go to court or not. Yeah? Whether there should or not be litigation. So grand jury is a kind of preliminary stage. They decide, they say, okay, this person is accused of I don't know, of murder or theft. The grand jury looks at it, says, actually, there's not enough evidence. Il n'y a pas assez de preuves. Il n'y a aucune preuve. Non, même pour débuter le procès. Yeah? So the grand jury decides there'll be no trial. Or the grand jury says, yes, there should be a trial. Okay? It used to exist in England. It's coming back in England, the grand jury. It doesn't exist. It's never existed in France. Okay, the grand jury. So there's the grand jury, and then later in the trial there is the jury, right? The 12 guys, right, in the jury. That's the grand jury. So, no person shall be held down to anything unless on the presentment or indictment of grand jury, except in the war, etc. Nor shall, these are legal protections, okay? Nor shall any person be subject for the same offence to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. Jeopardy means danger. Okay, that's what jeopardy means. This is called the double jeopardy clause. Double jeopardy. What it means is that you cannot be tried, jugé, cannot be tried twice for the same offence. Yeah? You can't be tried. Offence means a crime. Yeah, you can't be tried twice for the same offence. But, of course, now with ADN, yeah, DNA, you can be innocenté, and then they find your DNA. They realize, well, actually, no, it's you who did this. So now they're having to change the constitution, yeah, the amendment, to allow for retrials for the same offence. But jusque-là, c'était interdit. You could never, once you're innocenté, you're out. It's like, do you ever follow the case of O.J. Simpson? That black American football star, then actor, who was accused of murdering his wife and her lover. Yeah, he was acquitted. Yeah, and then of course he had to pay $35 million in civil damages because I don't know, it seems clear that he was guilty. But yeah, the question. Can you say that again louder, please? I didn't hear. Moi j'ai le micro, tu n'en as pas.
Si on fait le même délit deux fois, on peut juger.
Non, c'est pas faire le même délit deux fois, c'est être jugé pour le même délit deux fois. C'est être jugé deux fois qui est interdit. Pas que tu peux faire le délit, tu peux voler autant de voitures que tu veux. Hein? Okay, c'est ça. Si ça réussit, ça marche, je veux dire. Yeah. Double jeopardy. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. Yeah? You've seen American films and series, and the policemen, they arrest somebody, and they say you have the right to remain, what? Silent. Okay? You have the right, in America, it's a constitutional right. You don't talk. In France, if you do that, c'est un élément à charge. If you get arrested and you don't speak to the police, they take that as evidence of your culpability. Okay? Whereas in America, it's a constitutional right not to speak. Yeah? Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without a process of law, due process of law. Ça, c'est une phrase, il faut stabiloter, souligner, encadrer, écrire en or à côté. Due process. Okay, due process of law. Yes? I'm sorry? Où est-ce qu'il est dans la plaquette? J'étais en train de lire l'article 5. Oui, c'est la page 17, en haut à droite, article 5, Fifth Amendment. Okay? Due process of law. So, you cannot be, so this is really, really, really important. You cannot be deprived of liberty, in other words, you're presumed innocent until you're proved guilty. présomption, donc il est présumé innocent. How many times do you read in the media in France l'assassin présumé de la jeune fille? Yeah? L'assassin présumé, before the trial. If that happened in the United States, the media would be poursuivis en justice. They would have to close. Okay, they would be closed down by the Department of Justice, yeah, for using a phrase like assassin présumé, the presumed killer. Yeah. So, but of course, there are all kinds of weird things that happen in the law. Yeah, like in California, they had brought in a law called 3 strikes and you're out, which is a term from baseball. It meant that your third misdemeanor or crime was automatically 25 years in prison. Automatically. So there was a guy in California, his third crime was to steal a slice of pizza. Il a volé une tranche de pizza. He got 25 years in prison for that in California. So I continue reading, so just to concentrate. And then Article 6 is, so the Sixth Amendment is also a legal amendment, so in all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. Speedy, quick. You're arrested, you have the right to quickly trial. Okay, so you don't traîner in prison before your trial. Okay, this is against remand. Right. And the last, you're also entitled, in the last line of Article 6, you're entitled to the assistance of counsel, which is extraordinairement précoce. Counsel means a lawyer, an avocat. The government, on est en 1789, 90, okay? En 1790, you get arrested, the government will pay a lawyer to defend you. It's extraordinary. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's incredible how early that is. That's legal assistance, yeah, in the Sixth Amendment. Article 7, line 2, the right of trial by jury. Okay, again, it's a legal amendment. And then Article 8, c'est là où je voulais en venir. Article 8, it's very short. Excessive bail shall not be required. Bail is caution. Excessive bail shall not be required. Nor excessive bail is caution. Nor excessive fines imposed. Fine is an amende. I've told you before when I was talking about the historical part of this, is that landowners, moneylenders, slave owners, bankers, they wanted debt to be paid only in gold and silver, yeah, not in paper money, especially from tenant farmers, the artisan class, poor, indebted people, yeah, and they would be in prison, they would get excessive bail, they would get excessive fines, etc. So Jefferson and Madison, who wrote these, yeah, they tried to limit bail and fines. And the last one, nor, this very famous phrase, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So is the death penalty cruel and unusual? Right? Because if it's cruel and unusual, then it's unconstitutional, right? So that is a big question. And I want to talk about that in a moment. In the case of these a Jewish couple who were executed in the early 1950s, in 1951, called Rosenberg, yeah, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So they're Jewish, so what? So it's the beginning of the Cold War. There's a kind of hysteria in Washington about communists. The American labor organizations, the syndicats in the United States, and labor organizations generally, like the International Workers of the World, WTO, Mexicans and Jews. Yeah? The Lower East Side in New York was a Jewish quarter. It's where Jews arrived from Europe. And most left intellectuals in New York were Jews. Most labor leaders were Jewish or Mexican. The black civil rights movement was very closely associated with the American Jewish Association jusqu'à une rupture en 1976, pour une raison bien précise que je vais raconter. So Jews in America were associated with the left, okay, in Washington. Do you know why, for example, pourquoi vous avez en France le 1er mai férié? C'est grâce à qui, vous savez? C'est grâce aux syndicats américains. Mais dans les années 1880, et les émeutes de Haymarket de Chicago, which gave rise to the idea of a Labor Day, of a fête du travail, on the 1st of May. Eventually it was going to be a Sunday. So American trade unions were extraordinarily active. And so, 1947, an American senator called McCarthy, not McCartney, but McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, starts to investigate communists everywhere in America, especially Hollywood, for example. Yeah? Vous savez, il y a beaucoup de gens à Hollywood qui étaient mis sur une liste noire. Oui, il y a Charlie Chaplin, Bogart, il y a beaucoup de gens qui étaient sur une liste noire parce qu'ils avaient été soupçonnés d'être de gauche, essentiellement. Yeah? One of the great resistants of that was Humphrey Bogart. Do you know Bogart? Ce nom vous dit quelque chose? B-O-G-A-R-T, Humphrey, the film Casablanca. Bogart. So Bogart was a leader of the resistance. Il était très de gauche. Bogart, il est mort d'un cancer très tôt. So, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, these two Jews, were executed for spying for the Soviet Union. Okay? And they were perfect bouc émissaires. And they were executed with the electric chair. And when Ethel Rosenberg was executed on the electric chair, somebody noticed and photographed a little cloud of smoke came out of her head. Il y avait un petit nuage de fumée qui s'est levé de sa tête. She was burning, Ethel Rosenberg, yeah? You burn the chair, right? So they photographed this, and then they thought, okay, this must be cruel then, right? So then they therefore unconstitutional. So there's a whole debate, is the electric chair cruel or not? And then they started using like lethal injections, yeah? And they used 3 chemicals in lethal injection, which are supposed to be like just kind of sedatives, right? But then they discovered, of course, that they are very painful, yeah? And you can remain conscious as your organs are seizing up, right? So you have this terrible angoisse and things. So American pharmaceutical companies then refused to supply the chemicals, and then ils ont trouvé des sources en Angleterre pour ça. And then they stopped supplying the United States, etc. So, somebody condemned to death sentenced to capital punishment in Texas escapes to Massachusetts. Should the Massachusetts government state government then return them to be executed in Texas? Yeah. Well, usually, yes, okay. But then there's the question of the debate whether capital punishment is cruel and unusual or not. And what you do get, what happens often is that somebody who's condamné à mort in Texas escapes to Massachusetts. There's no death penalty in Massachusetts, where the sentence for the crime they've committed is, say, 25 years imprisonment, yeah? They would be imprisoned in Massachusetts, and then after 25 years, they're released from prison in Massachusetts, extradited to Texas, and executed in Texas, yeah, after 25 years in prison in Massachusetts. Yeah, this happens, right? So the question then comes, it's very different from a prison sentence, because a prison sentence after a trial is constitutional. Yeah? Whereas capital punishment may not be constitutional if it's considered to be cruel and unusual, right? So if Massachusetts has a law against capital punishment, because capital punishment is considered in Massachusetts cruel and unusual, then Massachusetts law is in conformity with the Constitution. Okay? So then you invoke Article 6 of the Constitution. So when you go to Article 6 of the Constitution, which is on the previous page, dans la page 16, Article 6, which is Article 6, Clause 2. Donc on est à la page 16 en bas à droite. Article 6, Clause 2. Yeah, can you look at that? This Constitution, donc je saute 3 lignes, shall be the supreme law of the land. Okay? C'est ce qu'il dit. I've looked at this before. This is the supremacy clause. This Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. Right? So that's clear. This Constitution is above, donc, comment on appelle le corps de loi, la collection des lois, des actes congrès? I gave you that name. Do you remember that? What kind of something law? Is that acts of parliament, des lois de l'Assemblée générale? Statute law. Yes, thank you. Good. Statute law. S-T-A-T-U-T-E. Statute law. À ne pas confondre avec state law, oui, qui est la loi des États. So the Constitution is above statute law. All right? But look what it says in the sentence. The Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof. Ça veut dire qu'ils vont dans le même sens que, en poursuivant la Constitution. Les lois, statute laws, qui sont faites dans le même sens que la Constitution. Yeah? Donc, they participate, those laws, federal laws and state laws, then participate in the supremacy of the Constitution. Right? Any law which is made in pursuance of the Constitution becomes the supreme law. So Massachusetts state law, which forbids capital punishment because it's cruel and unusual, donc qui transgresse le 8e amendement, yeah? Massachusetts state law then can be considered the supreme law, right? In the same way as the Constitution is the supreme law, because it pursues the principles of the Constitution. So then the full faith and credit clause of Article 4, yeah, Section 1, on vient de lire, ne s'applique plus. Yeah, do you see that? Je reviens dans l'article 4 de la Constitution. Section 1, full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings. Judicial proceedings are les jugements des tribunaux. Yeah? Of every other state. Means that every state must obey the court judgments of every other state. Donc le mec il est condamné à mort au Texas, a priori, Massachusetts doit obéir ce jugement, doit respecter ce jugement et extrader le mec vers le Texas. Okay? Unless, of course, Massachusetts law, which forbids capital punishment, can be considered the supreme law. Right? In which case they don't need to extradite him. Yeah. So capital punishment is one of those areas where it's very difficult to legislate, to decide. And abortion will be another. Yeah? Abortion is going to be another one of those. You know, where deciding the primacy of state and federal laws is going to be very difficult. Yeah? Okay, so to come back then to Article 1 and think about the legislature a little bit more. Yeah? Last week I talked about the structure of Congress. I talked congressmen and women. I talked about various powers. If you go to page 12 in your plaquette, just to give you a word again. Yeah. So we're in section 2, clause 5, page 12, en haut à gauche, numéro 5. The House of Representatives shall choose their speaker and other officers and shall have the sole power of impeachment. So the House of Representatives don't indict the president, whatever, they should choose their speaker. Speaker, là maintenant elle écrit avec un S majuscule. The speaker is the president of the House of Representatives. The speaker is the leader. It's like in France for the Assemblée, you have the perchoir. Yeah, you know that term? The perchoir is in the Assemblée nationale at Paris. Yeah. The speaker is a woman at the moment called Nancy Pelosi. Elle est donc le numéro 3 du régime de Biden, and she's very powerful. So the head of the House of Representatives is called the Speaker. The head of the Senate is called the President of the Senate. And the President of the Senate is the Vice President of the United States. Okay? At the moment, est-ce que vous savez la division entre Biden et les républicains au Sénat? Il y a combien de sénateurs? En tout. I've said this 1,000 times, no? Some. Yeah, there's 100 senators, okay? There's 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans, okay? So is it always going to be bloqué, the votes? No. It's because the vice president, who's called Kamala Harris, yeah, she's Biden's vice president, is the president of the Senate. So théoriquement, it's 51 démocrates, 50 républicains. Yeah. Biden was in Scotland recently, yesterday, 2 days ago, for this rather useless COP meeting. Yeah. And Biden wanted to talk about how wonderful his environmental policies are, which they're not. But he was always being asked about the failure of his domestic policy. Biden cannot pass his legislation. So qu'il a un programme de 2 trilliards de dollars de renouveau économique, green energy, all kinds of things. Yeah, but it doesn't pass because he can't get it through the Senate. Yeah, and yesterday the Democrats lost the state of Virginia. Yeah, the Republicans took Virginia. The governor of Virginia was elected as a Republican, à la grande surprise. And Biden and the Democrats are freaking out because in 1 year's time there is what's called the midterm elections. Yeah, ça veut dire la mi-chemin de la présidence. After a president is elected, tous les combien d'années? Un président est élu. How many years? 4. So midterm elections every 2 years. Okay? And representatives elected every 2 years. Senators are elected every 2, every 4, every 6 years. Yeah? 1/3 after 2 years, 1/3 after 4 years, 1/3 after 6 years. Okay? So if we look in section 3, page 12, je lis donc le texte, suivez le texte, donc page 12, section 3, clause 2, donc à gauche. Immediately after they shall be assembled in consequence of the first election, they, donc senators, they shall be divided as equally as may be into 3 classes. The seats of the senators of the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the second year, of the second class at the expiration of the 4th year, and of the third class at the expiration of the 6th year, so that 1/3 may be chosen every second year. Okay? So senators are re-elected every 6 years. 2, 2, and 2. Yeah? A third, a third, a third. Yeah? Un tiers des sénateurs, un tiers des sénateurs, un tiers des sénateurs. Okay? So There's elections every 2 years in America. Yeah, and every 2 years, every representative is elected, and 1/3 of the senators are elected. Another of the power is to the power of the Senate in impeachment, donc clause numéro 6. The Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. To try, ça veut dire quoi? Comment vous traduisez en français le mot to try? Juger, voilà. The Senate tries impeachments. When sitting for that purpose, there shall be an oath or affirmation sous serment. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. Chief Justice is donc the Chief Judge of the Supreme Court. Donc on est page 12 à gauche, section 3, tout en bas, numéro 6. The Chief Justice shall preside, and no person shall be convicted, condamné, without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. Okay, so for an impeachment trial, you need a majority of 2/3, les 2/3. For most votes in the Senate, you just need a simple majority. For other votes, you need 60%. So sometimes it's 50%, sometimes it's 60%. Here is 67%. You need senators to find the president guilty in an impeachment trial. Okay? So I want to go back to a word that I brought up last time, just thinking about some of the powers of Congress. The supreme power of Congress is in which domain? What's the field that Congress has most power in? And what kind of decisions does Congress hold the strings? The purse strings, in economic, financial decisions. Okay, yeah? And I give you a word. Do you remember the word, what you call une loi, dont la fonction est d'octroyer certains fonds à une utilisation de l'exécutif? To give money to the executive. Do you remember that? No? Okay, well, I'm going to look at that again. So, can we look, some of the things in the Constitution are archaic. Oui, si vous regardez, par exemple, page 13, section 8. Section 8, these are the powers of Congress. Number 11, we looked at briefly. To declare war, to grant letters of marque and reprisal. Does anybody know what that means? To grant letters of marque and reprisal. Can you work it out? And make rules concerning captures on land and water. What do you think that refers to? What do you think that refers to? Make rules concerning captures on land and water. Can you get it? Yeah, it's to give contracts to pirates, right? So that they work for the United States. I mentioned this briefly a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, letters of marque and reprisal are contracts to pirates, yeah, to work for the United States. Number 12, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. So this is what's called an appropriations bill. There's a limit. So an army only exists, an American army, costs money. It only exists because there has been an appropriation of public money by Congress for that purpose. If you turn over, you look at section 9, number 7, page 14. Section 9, clause 7. Yeah, can you look at that? It's on page 40 on the left, back in the middle of the page. No money shall be drawn from the treasury, tiré, pris. No money shall be drawn from the treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. And the regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. Appropriations made by law. I talked about this 2 weeks ago, but right at the end. Do you remember me talking about Bush's request for money for Iraq? Do you remember me talking about that? No? Donc en 2003, Bush wanted to invade Iraq. Yeah, I talked about this. No? You don't remember that? Yeah? And he got 2 appropriations bills through Congress. Yeah? So if you go back to like number 12, section 8, number 12, the money is limited to 2 years. No appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. So in other words, a war is only financed for 2 years. After 2 years, the executive needs to ask for another appropriations bill. So why 2 years? Because of course the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. Okay, c'est pour qu'on n'hérite pas des guerres des autres. C'est pour ça que c'est limité à 2 ans. Yeah? So the executive gets money for 2 years for the war, and then after 2 years they have to ask for more money. But now you have new representatives, because they're elected every 2 years, so they have to decide on a new appropriations bill. All right? So I want to look briefly just now at the legislative process. So if you come back to page 10, and look at the schema on page 10. I want to just go through this a little bit. I didn't mention enough about habeas corpus, je me rends compte. When I talk about the phrase due process of law, that an individual can only be arrested, imprisoned after due process of law, the clause number 2, section 9, donc en haut de la page 14, en haut à gauche, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. Yeah. I want you to note that phrase habeas corpus because it will be coming up several times. Yeah. Habeas corpus is that which I mentioned, the freedom of the individual. Okay. The obligation to free an individual who's not been tried. So on page 10 you have this scheme that I'd like to just look at briefly, yeah, which shows how bills become laws. So can you look at that please on page 10? On page 10. There's a picture in the top in the middle with a dome. Do you recognize that building? Do you know what that building is? The Capitol, yeah. And what's in the Capitol? What's in the Capitol? Anybody know? You saw Trump's people in January, yeah, invading the Capitol. So what's in the Capitol? Is the Congress. Okay, Congress is in the Capitol. Okay. The 2 houses. So a bill, a projet de loi, becomes a law. How does it become a law? So first of all, a sponsor must introduce the bill. Okay. So here on the left, you got juste à gauche, à droite de l'image du Capitole. There's a little square. On the left it says HR. On the right it says S. Yeah. Okay. So the left is the House of Representatives, and the right is the Senate. So what happens? How does a bill become a law? So first of all, it's introduced into the House, whether it's the representatives or the Senate, introduced by a sponsor. Okay? A sponsor. Sponsor here does not mean like Coca-Cola or Nike. A sponsor means a member of Congress. Right? So a member of Congress introduces the bill into the House. And then it goes through these different stages. Donc si vous regardez à gauche, yeah? It goes, first it's referred to a House committee, and then to subcommittees, and then to full committee, and then to a rules committee. Yeah, do you see that? You're following the text. Yeah? Committees are made up of people who are specialized in that area. For example, if a bill comes in concerning, for example, abortion, right? And they talk about like the heartbeat. Yeah, Texas has a heartbeat bill. Yeah, so as soon as there's a heartbeat, you can't have an abortion, right? So then you have questions, say, of bioethique. So who's going to decide, who is going to advise the Congress about legislation to do with bioethique? You need to have scientists, yeah? You need to have people who are experts, people who know the domain. So you have these committees in Congress, congressional committees. Congressional committees are committees of experts who advise Congress on passing legislation. They're very efficient committees. Essentially what happens is it goes through the left, okay, and then once it goes through all these committees, it goes to the other side, yeah, it goes to the other house, and then goes through the same set of processes. So it's like de l'eau filtrée une fois à gauche, et puis filtrée à droite. Yeah? There are differences though between the two sides, what they do, and then in the middle underneath they come to what's called conference action, yeah, where they come together. And then at the bottom of the page, you have a little picture of the White House. So the bill then is sent to the president. Okay. Those are the grand lignes. I want you for next week, I'm going to stop now because you guys have buses to catch and things here. I want you to read this page carefully. Yeah. And I start next week by talking in more detail about how a bill becomes a law. Okay? Alright? You're going to get a second plaquette, because next week I'll probably finish with the legislature. I want to go over some more things to do with the powers. Afterwards, we go on to the executive, and then on to the judiciary. So you'll get a second plaquette that deals with the executive and the judiciary. Alright? Okay? So after this, we have 5 more sessions. Okay, there'll probably be 1 on the legislature, 2 on the executive, and 2 on the judiciary. Okay? Alright? And then you're good. If you have any questions about anything or something's obscure or you haven't understood it, you can send me an email. Oui? Je reçois des emails des étudiants, j'en ai reçu pas mal, et je leur réponds assez rapidement. Okay, donc si vous avez une question, un problème, vous m'envoyez un email, je vous répondrai.